Europe didn't overtake Africa because Africans were behind. It overtook societies that had been engineered for stability, and the ending arrived with gunpowder on a date. That's the claim of the book in my hand, Cheikh Anta Diop's Precolonial Black Africa, and this episode exists to test it. In a chronicle finished in the 1600s, a scholar of Timbuktu named Sadi recorded the education he'd received from his master, Muhammad bin Mahmud bin Abu Bekr. Sadi wrote, as Diop's translation carries it, quote, "He awarded me graduate diplomas, written in his own hand, covering the subjects he had taught," end quote. What gets me is how casual that sentence is. He's not making a case. He's remembering school. Graduate diplomas is the translator Salim's son's rendering. The certificate's own name is ijaza, a license to teach, granted scholar to scholar in the master's own handwriting. The subjects taught in the city, the chronicle records elsewhere, included grammar, logic, rhetoric. And no European power would occupy that city until 1894, 3 centuries after the arrest this episode ends on. It's not only a fact about then, it changes how we read the explanation we inherit, the one where a conquered people must have been a lesser people. If the learning was real, the gap needs a real explanation, and the one the story leaves implied loses its footing. So here's the question this episode won't let go of. If it was that advanced, why did Europe overtake it so fast? We'll walk the ledger first, then the engine Diop says he found underneath it, then the arrests that broke Timbuktu's learned leadership after Songhai fell to a Moroccan army. And we end with the strongest case against Diop's own answer. Start with money. Diop opens his economics chapter against the specialist of his day, who described pre-colonial Africa as a barter world with no concept of money or credit. His verdict? Rarely, he says, has an opinion rested on so little fact. His evidence comes from the Arab geographers, in snapshots, different states, different centuries. And I'll keep the dates attached. A fixed quantity of gold dust, about 4 6/10 grams, served as the unit of account. The measure everything else was priced in, and it had a name, the mitkal. Diop, in Harold Sal Emson's translation, wrote, quote, "This was the gold standard, in the strictest modern sense of the term," end quote. That equivalence is his, and you can hear him daring his field to argue. The documentation underneath needs no rhetoric. Minted coins and cowrie shells exchanged against it, and the surviving records preserve the rate. 1 mitkal was worth 500 to 3,000 cowries, a variable exchange rate documented. A recorded moving exchange rate is hard evidence against that no money, no credit consensus. In the 900s, the geographer Ibn Hawkau reported seeing a written acknowledgement of debt, a man of Sigio Massa acknowledging what he owed a citizen of Al-Dagast, 40,000 dinars, the desert trade city holding the credit. Debt, in writing, for a sum Diop says had no equal even in Baghdad. Add market days fixed by the state, tax officers, border duties. In 1352, Ibn Battuta, crossing toward Mali with 1 hired guide, no caravan, because in his words, the roads were that secure. 1 traveler, 1 well-run route. And the state capacity reading is my inference, not his. Every snapshot makes our question harder, not easier. If money, credit, customs, and administration are in the record, the easy answer, it was primitive, isn't just wrong, it's unavailable. And the gap still happened. So why? Which brings us back to that ijaza. Because the higher learning is where the advanced Africa is hardest to dismiss and easiest to inflate. Size it honestly, both directions. The chronicler, Kati, counted 150 to 180 Quran schools in Timbuktu alone. His count, and the chronicles praise as much as they record. But even discounted, it describes a city where teaching was a central pillar of life. The city's teaching ran grammar, Aristotelian logic, rhetoric, attested in the chronicle called the Tarikh el Sudan, subjects Diop identifies as Europe's own trivium. Separately, the same chronicle gives the biographies of 17 scholars of the city, subject by subject. One of them, Ahmed Baba, carries a printed legend of more than 700 works. Diop keeps the hedge when he prints it, is said to have, and modern scholarship credits him with, roughly 40 to 60. The corrected number is still a working scholar's lifetime of books. Scholars kept private libraries, bought, the chronicles say, at the cost of sacrificing every other need. A dictionary was bought at a cost of 80 mitkals of gold. Now, the strongest objection, and the instinct here, if you love this material, is to look away. Don't. A skeptic will say, none of this adds up to a university, and the facts for that objection sit in Diop's own text. The mosque was not an official building, he says, but the pious undertaking of a devout judge. The teachers came from the clergy and were not officially paid, living on the offerings students brought on Wednesdays. The chronicle even preserves one teacher's take, about 1,700 cowries on a single Wednesday, 5 to 10 from each student. The ijaza was a personal license to teach, granted on the master's own judgment, not a state credential. So call it what the record supports: mosque-based higher learning, a taught program, named teachers, certificates in Arabic which served that world as Latin served Europe's, and students traveling in to earn them. If the word university bothers you, drop the word and keep the facts. And underneath them sits the deeper point, the chronicles themselves. Sadi and Kati were African scholars writing their own society's history in books. Sadi sometimes dates events to the day, and Diop reports that where those dates could be checked, they held in almost every case. So the paradox is now at full strength. The record supports a literate scholarly culture in Timbuktu. That is what was real, and it's still lost, fast. Diop believes he found the mechanism. The mechanism is the strangest and strongest idea in the book, and it starts in what looks like the driest chapter, the one about caste. The method, plainly, and it's his own account of it, Diop builds the model from the social order of Senegal, tells you so, and reads it outward across the old empires, which means, and this is my observation, not his, the evidence is richest exactly where he looked, and thinnest where the empires actually lived. What he describes in Senegal is not a pyramid of misery. It's a machine built to keep every rank invested in the whole. In his account, the upper orders couldn't squeeze the lower ones because honor ran the other way. A noble who exploited an artisan lost face. A noble, asked by a man of lower station, was bound to give. And what did he get back? Social precedence. That's it. The artisan, in Diop's words, kept the fruits of his work and could add to them the wealth given from above. Even the slaves of the crown, and Diop is blunt that slavery is in this picture, in the household and crown forms he documents, were folded into the state itself, the infantry drawn from their ranks, one of their number commanding the army of Kayor. In his words, slaves in name only. What he concludes is the hinge of the whole episode. Diop wrote, quote, "Consequently, If a revolution were to occur, it would be initiated from above and not from below. End quote. From above, not from below. Then he turns to Europe, reading antiquity through Fustel de Coulanges, and finds the opposite design. Rome and Athens, in the account he carries, were built on a mass of people with no hearth, no ancestors, no stake, nothing to conserve. In their uncompensated condition, he locates the deep cause of Europe's transforming revolutions. And Diop draws the last link himself. That constant churn of conflict, he argues, is what built Europe's industrial and technical world. Because the churn did the building, he says in the same breath, race explains none of it. The African order, in his extrapolation from Senegal, produced the opposite output. Compensated ranks, so no revolutionary mass. Abundance, he says, so no desperate scramble. Stability on purpose. And the cost, in his own concessions, examples of the ceiling he concedes, not causes of any one defeat. When the 19th century commander, Samori, had European rifles copied by local blacksmiths, the copies worked, but the metal, he concedes, fell short of the original quality. Benin's glass guilds reached what he calls a semi-industrial stage. Semi. The ceiling was real. Diop doesn't deny it. He reprices it. The pace gap wasn't a defect of the people. It was the bill for the equilibrium. But before we accept that, mark the exception his own chapter records. The poor peasants, the badolo, the people who by his own account fed the population and made up the majority. They carried the taxes, and a prince could pillage their goods without dishonor. The celebrated balance protected artisans and crown officials, which raises the question his chapter never quite answers, whether the compensations reached the majority at all. And if they didn't, then what Diop calls equilibrium may be what a suppressed majority looks like from the palace, a settlement that merely held. Either way, the gap now has a structural explanation on the table, and the racial one isn't just wrong, it's unnecessary. One thread stays open. A slower society is still a standing society. Why did this one stop? Because it was stopped. The story we inherit says the great empires faded. Past tense, no subject, no weapon. The record says otherwise. 2 guardrails first. The army that felled Songhai was Moroccan, not European. So this is no European conquest story. What the fall shows, on a date, is what the technical gap cost when force arrived. And the fall proves the gap was real, not that Diop's equilibrium caused it. A sultan of Morocco sent an army south across the desert, and Diop identifies the Tegeza salt mines on Songhai's northern border as the motive. The military defeat came in March 1591 at a place called Tondibi. There, the wider field of historians puts arquebuses, the early muskets, and cannon under the commander the field calls Judar Pasha and Diop calls Juder, against a larger Songhai force that had none of either. Firearms were decisive in that standard account. The occupation's violence, 1593 in Timbuktu, which is where Diop's chapter lives, and his date for the war. Tondibi is the military demonstration. What follows in Timbuktu is institutional violence. For the defeat itself, Diop wrote, quote, "Thanks to the firearms they had, they were easily victorious over the troops of Askia Ishaq II and seized Timbuktu." End quote. Arquebuses and cannon against an army that had none. Then comes the scene. The occupiers faced a city whose standing lived in its judges, professors, and jurists. The Pasha who replaced Juder, Mahmud bin Zergun, solved that the way occupiers do. The city's learned community, the entire Sudanese intelligentsia in Diop's phrase, was tricked into congregating in the Sankore Mosque. the same mosque where the courses ran all day. The doors were sealed, and everyone was released except, as the chronicle puts it, the jurists, their friends, and their followers. Diop wrote, quote, "They were thus arrested by Zergun on October 20th, 1593, without their having conspired, without any pretext whatsoever." End quote. 2 columns of prisoners were marched out. One was massacred on the road, the dead buried in a potter's field. The survivors were held for about 6 months, then deported across the desert to Marrakesh. In the caravan that left on March 18, 1594, walked Ahmed Baba, the city's most celebrated scholar. The libraries of his city, in Diop's account, were lost with the men who kept them. Size it honestly, because a scene this strong invites overstatement. Sadi kept writing, decades later, and his own preface laments a decline in learning that had begun before the soldiers came. What October 20th was, on the record, is a severe, targeted blow to the city's learned leadership. The mosque where masters certified what their students knew became the place where the men who knew were taken. That's what fell behind looks like when you give the sentence back its subject. Not just a fading, an arrest. Now the part this episode owes Diop and you. Beautiful answers deserve their hardest tests, and the caste equilibrium thesis is his boldest claim. Start with the objection his own method invites. When Diop describes Europe, he reaches for its bloodiest records. The Tudor vagrancy laws he takes from Marx's chapters, executions under Henry VIII, branding under Edward VI. When he describes Songhai's slavery, he reaches for the chronicle's gentlest passages, tribute capped by rule, slaves who owned wealth, a slave pardoned by the king after an unauthorized pilgrimage. Best case Africa, worst case Europe. Page against page. And here's the thing I keep circling back to. He knows it. Twice he says so against himself. Diop wrote, quote, "Slavery is certainly the great chink in African social organization," end quote. That sentence is him marking the weak point in his own case, on the page, before any critic could. And later, describing a king trading children for horses, he calls it a dark shadow over an almost too beautiful picture. His words, not his critics. Then there's the deeper counter-explanation, the one he underweights. Almost in passing, in the economics chapter, he names the slave trade's drain on the continent, and the number he cites, 100 to 300 million people, in his own words, dead or shipped to America, runs far beyond the ranges modern scholarship works with. One well-established series, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, counts about 12.5 million people embarked, and that is one defined trade and one measure, Atlantic embarkations, not a total for all routes or for deaths in raiding, an enormity that needs no inflation. But correcting his numbers settles nothing, because scale alone doesn't decide causes. 2 important alternative mechanisms sit on the table. Walter Rodney, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, argues the trade disrupted African development at its roots. Patrick Manning, in Slavery and African Life, counts the drain itself, the people the continent lost. Set their mechanisms beside his, and the question asks itself. Was the calm Diop measured, partly the quiet of a continent being bled? Remember the Badolo, whether the balance was a settlement rather than a harmony. Put it together. Firearms were decisive at Tondibi in the standard account. The drain and the disruption stand beside equilibrium as explanations for the wider gap. How much weight each carries, this record cannot establish, and I won't pretend it can. Either way, look at the table. His explanation is structural. His critics' explanations are structural. The dispute that remains is a dispute between structures. What's gone from the table is rank. So, the answer, in the order the evidence earns it: money, credit, licensed scholars, and written history are in the record, and that record supplies no support for racial hierarchy as an explanation. Every explanation this episode has examined is structural. What stays disputed is Diop's favorite structure, the equilibrium. There is real evidence behind it. It is not thereby verified as the cause of the slower pace. Whether it explains more or less than the drain and the disruption, this record cannot say. And underneath the dispute sits the contradiction Diop leaves open. If the design story is right, the same order that protected the people inside its compensations left them unprepared for the one upheaval that mattered. Admiring the design doesn't exempt it from explanation, and explaining the fall doesn't grade the society. Those are different instruments. The latter, my shorthand for the single line where every difference in pace is a difference in rank, is what Diop's book argues against. The map of trade-offs, what did this society optimize and what did it cost, is what he offers instead. So here's where I land, and where you're free not to. If Diop is right, a society can lose the race precisely because it succeeded at what it chose to optimize, and stability was an achievement with a price. If the drain account is right, the calm he measured was partly a wound he mistook for a design, and the Badolo had already told us the design had favorites. I think the honest reading holds both, the second disciplining the first, never erasing it. Read the book for the snapshots, the ijaza, the debt note, the equilibrium. Somewhere in it you'll pass that diploma again, written in a master's own hand, and it will look different now. Keep the drain in view the whole way through, and the next time a story tells you a people fell behind, ask who's holding the ladder and what happened to the map.